She wanted to be heard. She is not as forthcoming as she once was, as I once thought she was. It is up to her to mend what she has torn. Without looking at the Aes Sedai, she turned and rode away. Anura remained behind, eyes unblinking on Perrin's face. You are ta'veren, yes, but you are still only a thread in the pattern, as am I. In the end, even the Dragon Reborn is just a thread to be woven into the pattern. Not even a ta'veren thread chooses how it will be woven. Those threads are people, Perrin said wearily. Sometimes maybe people don't want to be woven into the pattern without any say. And you think this makes a difference? Not waiting on an answer, she lifted her reins and heeled her fine-ankled brown mare after Berelain in a gallop that fanned her cloak behind her. She was not the only Aes Sedai who wanted words with Perrin. No, he told Sioned firmly after listening to her, patting Stayer's neck. It was the rider wanted soothing, though. He wanted to be away from So Harbor. I said no, and I mean no. She sat her saddle stiffly, a pale little woman carved of ice, except that her eyes were dark coals burning, and she reeked of affronted fury barely in check. Sioned was mild as milk water with the wise ones, but he was not a wise one. Behind her, Alhara's dark face was a stone, gray streaking his curly black hair like frost. Winter's face was red above his curled mustaches. They had to accept what passed between their Aes Sedai and the wise ones, but Perrin was not. The wind whipped their water cloaks about, leaving their hands free for swords if need be. Rippling in the wind, the cloaks shifted in shades of gray and brown, blue and white. It was easier on the stomach than seeing them make parts of a man disappear. Some easier. If I have to, I'll send Adara to bring you back, he warned. Her face stayed cold, her eyes hot, yet a quiver ran through her, swaying the small white gem hanging on her forehead. Not from fear of what the Wise Ones would do to her if she had to be brought back, just from the same offense at Perrin that made her scent a hooked thorn. He was growing accustomed to offending Aes Sedai. Not a habit a wise man got into, but there seemed no way out of it. What about you? He asked Masuri. Do you want to stay in So Harbor as well? The slim woman was known for speaking straight to the point, direct as a green for all she was brown. But she said calmly, would you not send Adara after me too? There are many ways to serve, and we cannot always pick the ways we would wish. Which, come to think, might be to the point in a way. He still had no idea why she visited Masima in secret. Did she suspect that he knew? Masuri's face was a bland mask. Kirkland wore a bored expression. Now they were out of So Harbor. He managed to seem slumped while sitting his horse erect without a worry in the world or a thought in his head. A man who believed that of Kirkland would return the next day to buy a second pig in a poke. The townsfolk worked mechanically as the sun rose higher, like people who wanted to lose themselves in the task at hand, and feared the return of memories when they stopped. Perrin decided So Harbor was making him fanciful. Still, he thought he was right. The air beyond the walls still looked too dim, as though a shading cloud hung over the town. At noon, the cart drivers cleared patches of snow on the slope rising from the river to make small fires and brew weak tea with Leaves brewing their third pot, or maybe fourth. There had been no tea to be had in the town. Some of the drivers looked at the bridges as if thinking to enter So Harbor and see what they could find to eat. A glance at the dirt-caked people working the winnowing baskets sent them back to dig out their small bags of oatmeal and ground acorn. At least they knew that mix was clean. A few eyed the sacks already loaded on the carts, but the beans needed to be soaked and the grain run through the large hand mills that had been left back in the camp. And that was after the cooks picked out as many more weevils as they thought men could not stomach eating. Perrin had no appetite, not for the cleanest bread. But he was drinking what passed for tea from a battered tin cup when Laishan found him. The Karianan did not actually come to him. Instead, the short man in the striped dark coat rode slowly past the small fire where Perrin was standing, then reined in with a frown a little upslope. Dismounting, Laishan lifted his gelding's near forehoof and frowned at it. Of course, he did look up twice to see whether Perrin was coming. With a sigh, Perrin returned the dented cup to the blocky little woman he had borrowed it from, a graying cart driver who spread her dark skirts in a curtsy, and grinned and shook her head at Lation. Likely she could sneak 10 times as well as the fellow. Niold, squatting by the fire with his hands wrapped around another tin cup, laughed out loud so hard he had to wipe a tear from his eye. Maybe he was beginning to go crazy. Life at this place gave a man cheerful footing. Lation straightened long enough to make Perrin a leg and say, "I see you, my lord," then ducked back down to snatch up the foreleg again like a fool. You did not grab at a horse's legs that way unless you wanted kicking. But then Perrin expected nothing but foolishness, really. First there was Lation's playing at being Aiel, with his shoulder-long hair tied off in a tail at the nape of his neck in weak imitation of how Aiel cut theirs. And now the man was playing at being a spy. Perrin rested a hand on the gelding's neck to soothe the animal after all that snatching, and put an interested look on his face as he peered at a hoof that had absolutely nothing wrong with it. Except for a nick in the shoe where the iron might break in a few days.
Hey, Scratchy D-Man, how you doing?
His hands itched for farrier's tools. It seemed years since he had changed a horse's shoes or worked a forge.
Bastard Ball
I
was
thought you and my brother yesterday.
Head down.
His friend is traveling to sell his wares.
I don't think
he
wasn't playing Modern Warfare 3.
He said to ask whether
he wasn't lagging
catch
nothing.
up to you then.
He was playing God of
Peering in the
War.
horse's belly at the winnowers down by the river, he added,
Though it hardly looks as if you will be away before.
Perrin scowled down at the winnowing. He scowled at the line of carts waiting their turn to be loaded, at the half-dozen or so that already had their canvas covers lashed down. One of those held the first of the leather for patching.
Yeah,
boots
we
and
sound
candles
the
and
same
such.
sometimes.
No oil, though.
At least
Lamp
that's
oil
what
and
people
so Harper
say.
smelled as rancid as the cooking oil. What if Gaul and the maidens brought word of Fail? An actual sighting, perhaps. He would give anything to talk to someone who had seen her, could tell him she was unharmed. What if the shadow began to move suddenly? Tell Bulwer not to wait too long, he growled. As for me, I'll be away inside the hour. He was as good as his word.
Hell yeah.
Most of the carts and drivers had to be left behind
he
to
was
make the
telling me
one-day
that
journey back
today.
to camp on their own.
That you
Ray
thought
and
you
his
were
green-helmeted
talking to
soldiers
me.
to guard them, with orders that no one was to cross the bridges. Cold-eyed, appearing completely recovered from his breakdown, the Gildanon assured him that he was fit and ready. Very likely, orders or not, he would be going back into So Harbor just to convince himself he was not afraid.
Let's do a dab
Perrin
real
did not
quick.
waste time trying to talk him out of it. For one thing, Sioned had to be found. She was not precisely hiding, yet she had learned of his departure, and, leaving her warders to hold her horse quite openly, she dodged about on foot trying to keep carts between herself and him. The pale Aes Sedai could not hide her scent, though. Or if she could, she did not know it was necessary. She was surprised when he tracked her down quickly, and indignant when he marched her to her horse ahead of Stair. Even so, he was well under the hour riding away from So Harbor, with the winged guards making their ring of red armor around Barrelane.
How you been doing, D-Man?
Carts that trundled along behind the 3 remaining banners, and Nield grinning for all he was worth. Not to mention trying to chat up the Aes Sedai. Perrin did not know what to do if the fellow really was going mad. As soon as the rise hit So Harbor behind them, he felt the loosening.
Yeah, I'd definitely be glad whenever
between his shoulders.
I could stream my diamond
That left
painting
only
again.
10 others, and a knot of impatience twisting his belly. Barrelane's obvious sympathy could not loosen those. Nield's gateway took them from the snow-covered field to the small clearing of the traveling ground amid the towering trees, 4 leagues in a step. But Perrin did not wait for the handful of carts to come through. He thought he heard Barrelane make a vexed sound when he booted Stair to a quick trot back toward the camp. Or maybe it was one of the Aes Sedai. Much more likely. There was a sense of stillness when he rode in among the 2 rivers men's tents and huts. The sun still hung not too far off overhead in the gray sky, but there were no cookpots on the fires, and very few of the men gathered around the campfires, holding their cloaks close and peering intently into the flames. A handful were sitting on the rough stools that Ban Craw knew how to make. The rest stood or squatted. No one so much as looked up. Certainly no one came running to take his horse. Not stillness, he realized. Tension. The smell somehow minded him of a bow drawn to the point of breaking. He could almost hear the creak. As he dismounted in front of the red-striped tent, Daniel appeared from the direction of the low Aiel tents, walking fast. Sulin and Adara, one of the wise ones, were following him, and keeping up easily, though neither appeared to hurry. Sulin's face was a sun-dark leather mask. Adara's, barely revealed by the dark shawl wrapped around her head, was an image of calm. Despite her bulky skirts, she made as little sound as the white-haired maiden, not so much as a faint clink from her gold and ivory bracelets and necklaces. Daniel was chewing the edge of one thick mustache, absently pulling his sword an inch out of its rough leather scabbard and shoving it back hard. Pull and shove. He drew a deep breath before speaking. The maidens brought in 5 Shido, Lord Perrin. Arganda took them over to the Gildanan tents to put them to the question. Massima's with them. Perrin brushed aside Massima's presence inside the camp. Why did you let Arganda take them? He asked Adara. Daniel could not have stopped it, but the wise ones were a different proposition. Adara appeared not much older than Perrin, yet her cool blue eyes seemed to have seen far more than he ever would. She folded her arms beneath her breasts in a rattle of bracelets, and with a touch of impatience. Even Shido know how to embrace pain, Perrin Ebara. It will take days to bring any of them to talk, and there seemed no reason to wait. If Adara's eyes were cool, Sulin's were blue ice. My spear sisters and I could have done it faster ourselves, a little, but Denel Lewin said you wanted no blows struck. Gerard Arganda is an impatient man, and he mistrusts us. She sounded as though she would have spat if she were not Aiel. You may not learn much in any case. They are stone dogs. They will yield slowly, and as little as possible. In this, it is always necessary to put together a little from one with a little from another to make a picture. Embrace pain. There had to be pain when you put a man to the question. He had not let that thought form in his head before this. But to get Fail back... Have somebody rub Stayer down, he said roughly, thrusting the reins at Daniel. The Gildanan portion of the camp could not have been more different from the rude shelters and haphazardly placed tents of the Two Rivers men. Here, the peaked canvas tents stood in precise rows, most with a steel-tipped cone of lances standing at the entry flaps, and saddled horses tethered at the side ready to mount. The flicking of the horses' tails and the long streamers in the lances, lifting on a cold breeze, were the only disordered things to be seen. The paths between the tents were all the same width, and a straight line could have been drawn through the rows of cook fires. Even the creases in the canvas, from where the tents had been folded away at the bottom of carts until the snows came, made straight lines. All orderly and neat. A smell of oatmeal porridge and boiled acorn hung in the air, and some green-coated men were scraping the last of the midday meal from their tin plates with their fingers. Others were already scouring out the cookpots. None showed any sign of tension. They were just eating and doing chores with about equal pleasure. It was something that had to be done. A large knot of men stood gathered in a ring near the sharpened stakes that marked the outer edge of the camp. No more than half wore the green coats and burnished breastplates of Gildanan lancers. Some of the others carried lances or had swords belted over their rumpled coats. Those ranged from fine silk or to the pickings of a rag bag, but none could be called clean except in comparison to So Harbor.
Take a dab
Could
and
always
get a
tell
drink real
Massima's men,
quick.
even from the back. Another smell came to him as he approached the circle of men. The smell of meat roasting. And there was a muffled sound that he tried not to hear. When he began pushing his way through, the soldiers looked around at him and gave way grudgingly. Massima's men started back, muttering about yellow eyes and shadow spawn. Either way, he gained passage to the front. 4 tall men, red-haired or pale in the gray and brown cotton sore, lay bound with their wrists lashed to their ankles and the small of their backs, and stout lengths of branch tied behind their knees and elbows. Their faces were battered and bruised, and they had wadded rags tied between their teeth. The 5th man was naked, staked out between 4 stout pegs driven into the ground, and stretched so tight his sinews stood out. He thrashed as much as his binding allowed, though, and howled into the rags stuffing his mouth, a muffled bellow of agony. Hot coals made a small cluster on his belly, giving off a faint smoke. It was the smell of blistering flesh that Perrin's nose had caught. The coals clung to the stretched man's skin, and every time his writhing managed to throw one off, a grinning fellow in a filthy green silk coat, squatting beside him, used a pair of tongs to replace it with another from a potful, melting a circle of mud in the ground. Perrin knew him. His name was Hari, and he liked to collect ears strung on a leather cord. Men's ears, women's ears, children's ears. He never minded to Hari. Without thinking, Perrin strode forward and kicked the little pile of coals off the bound man. Some of them struck Hari, who jumped back with a startled squeal that turned to a shriek when his hand came down in the pot. He toppled over sideways, cradling his burned hand and glaring at Perrin, a weasel in a human skin. "The savage makes a sham, eh, Bara?" Masima said. Perrin had not even noticed the man standing there, face like a scowling stone beneath his shaved scalp. His dark, fevered eyes held a measure of contempt. The scent of madness skittered through the stink of burned flesh. "I know them. They pretend to feel pain, but they do not. Not the way other men do. You must be willing and able to hurt a stone to make one of them talk." Arganda, rigid beside Masima, was gripping his sword hilt so hard that his hand shook. "Perhaps you are willing to lose your wife, Ibarra," he grated. "But I will not lose my queen." "It has to be done," Aram said, half pleading, half demanding. He was on Masima's other side, clutching the edges of his green cloak as if to keep his hands from the sword on his back. His eyes were almost as hot as Masima's. "You taught me that a man does what he must." Perrin forced his fists to unknot. What had to be done for Fail. Berylane and the Aes Sedai came pushing through the crowd, Berylane wrinkling her nose slightly at the sight of the man stretched out between the pegs. The three Aes Sedai might have been looking at a piece of wood for all their expression. Idara and Sulan were with them, neither more effective. Some of the Gildanan soldiers were women, Masima's red-faced men glared at Aiel and Aes Sedai alone. Most edged away from the three warders, and those who did not were pulled away by their companions. Some fools knew the limits of stupidity. Masima glared at Berylane with burning eyes before deciding to pretend she did not exist. She knew no limits. Bending, Perrin untied the rope around the man's mouth and tugged the wad from between his teeth. He just managed to keep from a snap as vicious as any stare could have given. Immediately, the Aielman threw back his head and began to sing in a deep, clear voice. "Wash the spears while the sun climbs high. Wash the spears while the sun falls low. Wash the spears, who fears to die? Wash the spears, no one I know." Masima's laughter rose in the middle of the singing. Perrin's hackles rose too. He had never heard Masima laugh before. It was not a pleasant sound. He did not want to lose a finger, so he pulled his axe out of its belt loop, carefully used the against the man's chin to push his hand short. Eyes the color of skin him out of a sun-dark face, unafraid. The man smiled. "I don't ask you to betray your people," Perrin said. His throat hurt with the effort of keeping his voice steady. "You Shido captured some women. All I want to know is how to get them back. One is named Fail. She's as tall as one of your women, with dark tilted eyes, a strong nose and a bold mouth. A beautiful woman. You'd remember her if you had seen her. Have you?" Pulling the axe away, he straightened. He stared at him for a moment, then raised his head and began to sing again, never taking his eyes from Perrin. It was a jolly song, the rollicking sound of a dance. "I once met a man who was far from home. His eyes were yellow and his wits were stone. He asked me to hold smoke in my hand, and he said he could show me a watery land. He put his head in the ground and his feet in the air, and said he could dance like a woman fair. He said he could stand till it turned to stone. When I blinked my eyes, he was gone." Letting his head fall back, the shadow chuckled, deep and rich. He could have been lunging at him. If you can't do this," Aram said desperately, "then go away. I'll help see to it." What had to be done? Perrin looked at the faces around him. Arganda scowling with hatred, at him as much as the Shido now. Masima stinking of madness and filled with a scornful hate. You must be willing and able to hurt a stone. Idara, her face as unreadable as the Aes Sedai's, arms folded calmly beneath her breasts. Even Shido know how to embrace pain. It will take days. Sulan, the scar across her cheek still pale on her leathery skin, her gaze level and her scent implacable. They will yield slowly and as little as possible. Berylane, smelling of judgment, a ruler who had sentenced men to death and never lost a night's sleep. What had to be done? Willing and able to hurt a stone. Embrace the pain.
Vail.
The axe was as light as a feather rising in his hand, and came down like a hammer on the anvil, the heavy blade shearing through the Shido's left wrist. The man grunted in pain, then reared up convulsively with a snarl, deliberately spraying the blood that gouted from his wrist across Perrin's face. "Heal him," Perrin said to the Aes Sedai, stepping back. He did not try to wipe his face. The blood was seeping into his beard. He felt hollow. He could not have lifted the axe again if he had to for his life. "Are you mad?" Masuri said angrily. "We cannot give the man back his hand." "I said heal him," he growled. Sionid was already moving, though, lifting her skirts to glide across the ground and kneel at the man's head. He was biting at his severed wrist, trying futilely to stem the flow of blood with the pressure of his teeth. But there was no fear in his eyes, or in his smell. None. Sionid gripped the Shido's head, and suddenly he convulsed again, flinging his arm out wildly. The spray of blood dwindled as he jerked, and was gone before he slumped back to the ground, gray-faced. Unsteadily, he raised the stump of his left arm to look at the smooth skin that now covered the end. If there was a scar, Perrin could not see it. The man bared teeth at him. He still did not smell afraid. Sionid slumped too, and to her limit. Alhara and Winter took a step forward, and she waved them away, rising by herself with a heavy sigh. "I've been told you can hold up for days and still say next to nothing," Perrin said. His voice sounded too loud in his ears. "I don't have time for you to show how tough you are, or how brave. I know you're brave and tough, but my wife's been a prisoner too long. You'll be separated and asked about some women, whether you've seen them and where. That's all I want to know. There'll be no hot coals or anything else, just questions. But if anybody refuses to answer, or if your answers are too difficult, then everybody loses something." He was surprised to find that he could lift the axe after all. The blade was smeared with red. "2 hands and 2 feet, he said coldly. Light, he sounded like ice. He felt like ice to his bones. "That means you get 4 chances to answer the same. And if you all hold out, I still won't kill you. I'll find a village to leave you in. Some place that will let you beg. Somewhere the boys will toss a coin to the fierce Aielmen with no hands or feet. You think on it, and decide whether it's worth keeping my wife from me." Even Massimo was staring at him as if he had never seen the man standing there with an axe. When he turned to go, Massimo's men and the Gildanon alike parted in front of him as though to let a whole fist of Trollocs through. He found the hedge of sharpened stakes in front of him, and the forest 100 paces or so beyond, but he did not change direction. Carrying the axe, he walked until huge trees surrounded him, and the smell of the camp was left behind. The smell of blood he carried with him, sharp and metallic. There was no running from that. He could not have said how long he walked through the snow. He barely noticed the sharpening slant of the bars of light that sliced the shadows beneath the forest canopy. The blood was thick on his face, in his beard, beginning to dry. How many times had he said he would do anything to get Fael back? The man did what he had to. For Fael, anything. Abruptly, he raised the axe behind his head in both hands, and hurled it as hard as he could. It spun end over end and slammed into the thick trunk of an oak with a solid thunk. Letting out a breath that seemed locked in his lungs, he sank down on a rough stone outcrop that stuck up as high and as broad as a bench, and put his elbows on his knees. "You can show yourself now, Elias," he said wearily. "I can smell you there." The other man stepped lightly out of the shadows, yellow eyes glowing faintly beneath the wide brim of his hat. The Aiel were noisy compared to him. Adjusting his long knife, he took a seat beside Perrin on the outcrop, but for a time he merely sat combing his fingers through the gray-streaked beard that fanned across his chest. He nodded toward the axe stuck in the side of the oak. "I told you once to keep that till you got to like using it too much. Did you start liking it? Back there?" Perrin shook his head hard. "No, not that. But what, boy? I think you almost have Massima scared. Only you smell scared, too." "About time he was scared of something," Perrin muttered, shrugging uncomfortably. Some things were hard to give voice. Maybe it was time to, though. The axe. I didn't notice it the first time, only looking back. That was the night I met Gaul, and the White Cloaks tried to kill us. Later, fighting Trollocs in the Two Rivers, I wasn't sure. But then at Dumais Wells, I was. I'm afraid in a battle, Elias. Afraid and sad, because maybe I'll never see Fail again. His heart clenched till his chest hurt. Fail. Only... I've heard Grady and Nield talk about how it is holding the One Power. They say they feel more alive. I'm too frightened to spit in a battle. But I feel more alive than any time except when I'm holding Fail. I don't think I could stand it if I came to feel that way about what I just did back there. I don't think Fail would have me back if I came to that. Elias snorted. I don't think you have that in you, boy. Listen, danger takes different men in different ways. Some are cold as clockwork, but you never struck me as the cold sort. When your heart starts pounding, it heats your blood. Stands to reason it heightens your senses, too. Makes you aware. Maybe you'll die in a few minutes, maybe in a heartbeat. But you're not dead now. You know it from your teeth to your toenails. Just the way things are. Doesn't mean you like it. I would like to believe that, Perrin said simply. Live as long as I have, Elias replied in a dry voice, and you'll believe. Till then, just take it that I've lived longer than you have, and I've been there before you. The two of them sat looking at the axe. Perrin wanted to believe. The blood on his axe looked black now. Blood had never looked so black before. How long had it been? From the angle of the light sifting through the trees, the sun was falling. His ears caught the crunch of hooves in the snow, slowly coming toward him. Minutes later, Niald and Aram appeared, the one-time tinker pointing out tracks and the Ashaman shaking his head impatiently. It was a clear trail, but in truth, Perrin would not have bet on Niald being able to follow it. He was a city man. Argenda thought we ought to wait till your blood cooled, Niald said, leaning on his saddle and studying Perrin. Me? I think it can't get any cooler. He nodded, a touch of satisfaction around his mouth. He was accustomed to people being afraid of him, because of his black coat and what it represented. They talked, Aram said, and they all gave the same answers. His scowl said he did not like the answers. I think the threat of leaving them to beg frightened them more than your axe. But they say they've never seen the Lady Fail, or any of the others. We could try the coals again. They might remember then. Did he sound eager? To find Fail or to use the coals? Elias grimaced. They'll just give you back the answers you've already given them now. Tell you what you want to hear. It was a small chance anyway. There's thousands of Shido and thousands of prisoners. A man could live his whole life among that many people and never meet more than a few hundred to remember. Then we have to kill them, Aram said grimly. Sulan said the maidens made sure to take them when they had no weapons so they could be questioned. They won't just settle down to be Gaishain. If even one escapes, he can let the Shido know we're here. Then they'll be coming after us. Perrin's joints felt rusted, aching as he stood up. He could not just let the Shido go. They can be guarded, Aram. Haste had almost lost him Fail completely, and he had been hasty again. Hasty. Such a mild word for cutting off a man's hand. And to no purpose. He had always tried to think carefully and move carefully. He had to think now, but every thought hurt. Fail was lost in a sea of white-clad prisoners. Maybe other Gaishain would know where she is, he muttered, turning back toward the camp. But how to put his hands on any of the Shido's Gaishain? They were never allowed outside the camp except under guard. What about that, boy? Elias asked. Perrin knew what he meant without looking. The axe. Leave it for whoever finds it. His voice turned harsh. Maybe some fool gleeman will make a story out of it. He strode away toward the camp, never looking back. With its empty loop, the thick belt around his waist was too light. All to no purpose. 3 days later, the carts returned from So Harbor, heavy laden, and Bulwer entered Perrin's tent with a tall, unshaven man wearing a dirty woolen coat and a sword that looked much better cared for. At first, Perrin did not recognize him behind an untrimmed month's growth of beard. Then he caught the man's scent. "I never expected to see you again," he said. Bulwer blinked, as much as a gasp of startlement from anyone else. Doubtless the bird-like little man had been looking forward to presenting a surprise. "I've been searching for Megden," Talonvor said roughly. "But the Shido moved faster than I could. Master Bulwer says you know where she is." Bulwer gave the younger man a sharp look, but his voice remained as dry and emotionless as his scent. "Master Talonvor reached So Harbor just before I left, my lord. It was the merest chance that I encountered him, but perhaps a fortunate chance. He might have some allies for you. I will let him tell it." Talonvor frowned at his boots and said nothing. "Allies?" Perrin prompted. "Nothing less than an army would be much use, but I'll take any aid you can bring." Talonvor looked at Bulwer, who returned a half bow and a blandly encouraging smile. The unshaven man drew a deep breath. 15,000 Shonchan, near enough. Most are Terrabonners, actually, but they ride under Shonchan banners. And they have at least a dozen Damani. His voice quickened with urgency, a need to finish before Perrin could cut him off. "I know it's like taking help from the Dark One, but they're hunting the Shido too, and I'd take the Dark One's help to free Megden." For a moment, Perrin stared at the two men, Talonvor nervously thumbing his sword hilt, Bulwer like a sparrow waiting to see which way a cricket would hop. Shonchan. And Damani. Yes, that would be like taking the Dark One's help. "Sit down and tell me about these Shonchan," he said. Chapter 28. A Cluster of Rosebuds. From the day they left Abu Dar, traveling with Val and Luca's grand traveling show and magnificent display of marvels and wonders, was every bit as bad as Matt's darkest thoughts had made it. For one thing, it rained almost every day for a few hours, and once for 3 days running. Cold winter rain, in downpours little short of snow and icy drizzles, that slowly soaked a coat through and left you shivering before you knew it. Water ran off the hard-packed road as if it had been paved in stone, leaving at worst a thin slick of mud, but that long train of wagons and horses and people covered little enough ground when the sun shone. In the beginning, the showfolk had been all eagerness to leave the city, where lightning sank ships in the night and strange murders had everyone looking over their shoulders, to be away from a jealous Shonchan nobleman who would be hunting his wife furiously and might take out his anger on anyone associated with spiriting her out of his clutches. In the beginning, they pressed ahead as fast as the horses could pull the wagons, urging the animals for a quicker step, another mile. But every mile seemed to make them feel that much farther from danger, that much safer. And by the first afternoon... "I have to take care of the horses," Luca explained, watching the team unhitched from his ridiculously painted wagon and led away to the horse lines through a light drizzle. The sun still sat little more than halfway down to the horizon, but already gray tendrils were rising from the smoke holes of tents and the metal chimneys of the box-like living wagons. "Nobody's chasing us, and it's a long way to Lugard. Good horses are hard to come by and expensive." Luca gave a sour frown and shook his head. Mention of expense always soured him. He was tight with a penny except where his wife was concerned. "Not many places between here and there worth stopping more than a day. Most villages won't provide a full crowd even if the whole population turns out, and you can never tell how a town will be until you set up. You're not paying me enough to give up what I can earn, though." Hitching his embroidered crimson cloak closer against the damp, he glanced over his shoulder toward his wagon. The smell of something bitter drifted through the light rain. Matt was not sure he would want to eat anything Luca's wife cooked. "You're certain nobody is chasing us, right, Coffin?" Irritably tugging his woolen cap lower, Matt stalked away through the brightly colored sprawl of tents and wagons, grinding his teeth. Not paying enough? For what he had offered, Luca should have been willing to run his animals all the way to Lugard. Well, not exactly run. He did not want to kill horses after all. But that puffed-up popinjay should have been willing to bloody push hard. Not far from Luca's wagon, Chell Vannin was seated on a three-legged stool that he overlapped, stirring some sort of dark stew in a small kettle that hung over a small fire. Rain dripped into the kettle from the drooping brim of his hat, but the fat man did not seem to notice or care. Gorderon and Fergan, two of the Red Arms, rumbled curses as they drove pegs into the muddy ground for the guy ropes of the dirty brown canvas tent they shared with Harnan and Metwin. And with Vannin, too, but Vannin possessed skills that he considered put him above raising tents, and the Red Arms agreed with only a little reluctance. Vannin was an experienced farrier, but more importantly, he was the best tracker and the best horse thief in the country, unlikely as that seemed to look at him, and you could name the country you chose. Fergan caught sight of Matt and bit off an oath as his hammer missed the tent peg and hit his thumb. Dropping the hammer, he stuck the thumb in his mouth and squatted there complaining shrilly around it.
We're gonna have to be out on this all night guarding those women, my lord. Can't you hire some of those horse handlers to do this so we can at least stay dry till we have to get wet?
Gorderon poked Fergan's shoulder with a thick finger. He was as wide as Fergan was skinny, and a tyrant despite his gray eyes.
Horse handlers will put up the tent and steal everything in it that's loose, Fergan.
Another poke.
You want one of those light fingers walking off with my crossbow or my saddle? That's a good saddle.
A third poke nearly pushed Fergan over sideways.
We don't get this tent up and Harnan will have us standing guard all night.
Fergan glowered and grumbled, but he picked up his hammer, wiping the mud off on his coat. He was a good enough soldier, but not very bright. Vannin spat through the gap in his teeth, just missing the kettle. The stew smelled wonderful after what Littell was making, but Matt decided he was not going to eat here either. Tapping his wooden spoon in the rim of the kettle to clean it, the fat man looked up at Matt through heavy-lidded eyes. His round face often looked half asleep, but only a fool believed it.
At this rate, we'll reach Lugard about the end of summer, if we ever do.
We will, Vannin, Matt said, more confidently than he felt at the moment. The rough woolen coat he had donned dry a few hours ago only shed rain in spots, and water was trickling down his back. It was hard to feel confident with icy rain sliding down your backbone.
Winter's almost done. We'll move faster once spring comes. You'll see. Come the middle of spring and we'll be in Lugard.
He was not so sure of that either. They covered no more than 2 leagues that first day, and after that, 2.5 made a good day. Not many places could be called towns along the Great North Road, a name that began to change very quickly as the show crept north. People called it the Abu Dar Road or the Ferry Road, or sometimes just the road, as if there were only one. But Lucas stopped at every last town, real or so-called, walled or jumped-up village with 6 streets and a rough-paved excuse for a town square. Near half a day went into just getting the show set up, and the canvas wall erected around it with that huge red-lettered blue banner hung across the entrance. Valan Luca's Grand Traveling Show. It was just not in Luca to pass up the chance of a crowd, or the coins in their purses, or the chance to flourish one of his bright red cloaks and bask in their adulation. Luca liked that almost as much as the coin. Almost. The strangeness of the performers and the caged animals from far-off lands were sufficient to pull people. The animals from not so far were enough, for that matter. Few had been far enough into the countryside to see a bear, much less a lion. Only heavy rain lessened the crowd. And when the rain was too stiff, the jugglers and acrobats refused to perform anyway without some sort of covering overhead, which made Lucas talk about in a sullen snit, and talk wildly of finding enough canvas tarps to shelter every act, or having a tent made large enough to hold the entire show. 1 tent. The man was nothing if not grandiose in his ambitions. Why not a palace on wheels while he was about it? If Luca and the slow way the show moved had been all Matt had to worry about, though, he would have been a happy man. Sometimes 2 or 3 slow-moving trains of Shanshan settlers who had gotten an early start passed with their strangely shaped peaked wagons and odd-looking cattle or sheep or goats before the first wagon from the show began to move. Sometimes columns of Shanshan soldiers overtook them as they ambled along at a slow walk, ranks of men wearing helmets like huge insects' heads, stepping out smartly, and columns of horsemen with their armor of overlapping plates painted in stripes. Once, the riders were on Torm, bronze-scaled creatures like horse-sized cats, except for having 3 eyes, anyway. 20 or so of them sneaking along in a sinuous lope faster than a horse could trot. Neither the riders nor their mounts gave the show a second glance, but the show's horses went wild as the torm passed, screaming and rearing in the traces. The lions and leopards and bears roared in their cages, and the peculiar deer flung themselves against the bars trying to flee. It took hours to quiet everything down enough for the wagons to move again, and Luca insisted on having the caged animals' scrapes seen to first. His animals were a large investment. Twice, officers in thin-plumed helmets decided to check the warrant for Luca's horses, and Matt oozed cold sweat the size of grapes until they moved on again, satisfied. As the show crept north, the numbers of Shanshan on the road dwindled, yet he still sweated when he saw another party, soldiers or settlers, either one. Maybe Soroth really was keeping Tuan's disappearance a secret, but the Shanshan would be searching for her. All it would take was one meddlesome officer who actually compared the numbers on the warrant with the number of horses. He would search the wagons with a fine-tooth comb after that for certain. Just one officious Suldam who thought there might be a woman who could channel among the jugglers and tumblers and contortionists. He sweated plums. Unfortunately, not everyone had a proper regard for their own skins. Outside a fly-speck village called Wiesen, a thatch-roofed little cluster of houses where not even Luca thought 2 coppers could be shaken loose, Matt stood with a heavy woolen cloak pulled around him in a driving rain and watched the 3 Aes Sedai steal back into the show as the sun set. Thunder boomed in the distance. They were swathed in dark cloaks with the hoods well up, yet he had no doubts who they were. In the downpour, they passed within 10 feet without seeing him, but the silver medallion hanging beneath his shirt went cold against his chest. At least one of them was channeling, or holding the power anyway. Burn him, they were all 3 mad as loons. No sooner did the Aes Sedai vanish among the wagons and tents than 3 more cloaked shapes appeared, hurrying after them. One of these women had a sharper eye, raising a hand to point at him, but the others only paused, and then they scurried after the Aes Sedai together. He started to curse, then left it unuttered. He was beyond that. If he named the people he wanted wandering around where a Shanshan patrol might see them, the Aes Sedai and the Suldam would come about, even with Tuan and Selucia. "I wonder what they want," Noel said behind him, and Matt gave a jump that let a torrent of rain into his cowl and down his neck. He wished the knobbly old man would quit sneaking up on him. "I intend to find out," he muttered, jerking his cloak straight. He hardly knew why he bothered. His coat was only a little damp, but his linen shirt was already soaked. Oddly enough, Noel was no longer with him when he reached the gray-streaked wagon with its fading whitewash where the Aes Sedai and Suldam slept. The man liked sticking his nose in everywhere. Maybe he had decided he was wet enough. Blarick and Fen were already wrapped in their blankets beneath the wagon, apparently oblivious to rain or mud, but he would not have wagered on either being asleep. Indeed, one sat up as he squelched up to the wagon. Whichever it was, he said nothing, yet Matt could feel the man's eyes. He did not hesitate, though, and he did not bother with knocking. The interior was crowded with all 6 women on their feet, dripping cloaks still in hand. 2 lamps, mounted in gimbals on the walls, gave a good light, better than he could have wished for in a way. 6 faces swiveled toward him with those frozen looks women give a man when he put a foot where they did not want it. The air in the wagon smelled of damp wool and felt as if lightning had just struck, or might at any moment. Rain drummed on the roof and thunder rolled, but the fox-head medallion felt no cooler than any other piece of silver. Maybe Blarick and Finn had let him come inside thinking he would get his head snapped off. Maybe they just wanted to stay out of this themselves. But then, a warder was ready to die if his Aes Sedai decided it was necessary. Not Matt Cawthon. He pushed the door shut with his hip. It hardly gave him a twinge anymore. Seldom, anyway. When he challenged them, Edicina fiercely, shaking out the black hair that spilled down her back. "I am grateful to you for rescuing me from the Shanshan, Master Cawthon, and I will show my gratitude. But there are limits. I am not your servant to be ordered about. There were no Shanshan in the village, and we kept our faces hidden. There was no need to send your watchdogs after us." The look she shot at the 3 Shanshan women could have fried eggs. Edicina was being over-nervous about anyone with a Shanshan accent. She wanted some of her own back, and the Suldam were close to hand. Matt was counting on that fabled Aes Sedai self-control to keep matters short of violence. He hoped it was not already stretched too far to hold. Those old memories recalled Aes Sedai going up like illuminators' wares. Bethamin's dark face showed no sign of alarm. She had finished shaking out her cloak and hanging it on a peg while Edicina was speaking, then smoothed her dress over her hips. Tonight she wore faded green petticoats. She complained that the Ebudari garment was indecent, and he supposed that he would have to find her something else now they were away from the coast, but she did fill out that very low neckline nicely. She sounded too much like a mother for his taste, though. "They did keep their faces hidden, my lord," she drawled, "and they stayed together. No one tried to sneak off. Very well behaved, all in all." A mother praising her children, or maybe a dog trainer praising the dogs. Yellow-haired Sita nodded approvingly. Definitely a dog trainer. "If my lord wishes to keep them confined," Brenna said fulsomely, "we can always use the Idam. They really shouldn't be trusted loose." She even offered him a bow, in the Shan way, bending herself at a sharp right angle. Her big brown eyes looked hopeful. Teslin gasped and clutched her wet cloak to her bosom. She certainly was not over her fear of the Suldam. For all she looked as though she could eat nails. Jolene, haughty as ever, drew herself up, eyes flashing. Aes Sedai serenity or no, lightning might as well strike when Jolene's eyes started flashing. It was often so with pretty women. "No," Matt said hastily. "There's no need for that. You give those things to me and I'll get rid of them." Light, why had he ever saddled himself with these women? What seemed the best idea at the time could look pure quill stupid in hindsight. "All of you just have to be careful. We're not 30 miles from Ebudar yet. The roads are full of bloody Shanshan." He gave an apologetic look to the 3 Shanshan women. They were on his side, after all, in a manner of speaking. They had nowhere else to go except to Guinan, and they had realized who had the money. Bethamin's eyebrows twitched upward in surprise. Shanshan nobles did not apologize, even with a glance. "Shanshan soldiers did pass through the village yesterday," Teslin said, her Ilianer accent particularly strong. Jolene's flashing eyes shifted to her, but she took no notice beyond turning away to hang up her own cloak. "They did ask questions about strangers on the road, and some did complain about being sent north." Teslin glanced over her shoulder at the Suldam, then jerked her eyes away and took a deep breath. "It does seem the return be aimed east. The soldiers did believe the ever-victorious army will present Ilian to their empress before the end of spring. The city itself, and all the rest." Supposedly, Aes Sedai gave up the lands of their birth when they went to the White Tower, but to any Ilianer, the city of Ilian was the city, capital City, and you could hear the capital. "That's good," Matt said half to himself, thinking. Soldiers talked out of turn all the time. That was one reason you did not tell your plans to every trooper until the last minute. Teslin's thin eyebrows rose, and he added, "It means the road to Lugard will be clear most of the way." Teslin's nod was curt and not very pleased. What Aes Sedai were supposed to do, and what they did, were often widely different. "We didn't speak to anyone, my lord. Only watched the girls," Bethamin said, even more slowly than usual, and Shanshan usually talked like honey, pouring in a snowstorm. She was clearly in charge among the 3 Suldam, but she looked at each of the others before going on. "In Ebudar, all the talk in the Suldam quarters was of Ilian. A fat land and a fat city, where many would earn new names. And wealth." She tossed that in as if wealth hardly counted alongside a new name. "We should have realized you'd want to know about such things." Another deep breath almost popped her out of that dress. "If you have any questions, my lord, we'll tell you what we know." Rana made him another bow, her face eager, and Sita piped up with, "We could listen in the towns and villages where we stop too, my lord. The girls can be shifty, but you can trust us." Why, when a woman offered to help you, did she always start by sticking you in a pot of hot water and stoking up the fire? Jolene's face became a disdainful mask of ice. The Shanshan women were beneath her notice. She made that clear with a glance. It was Matt Bloody Cawthon who received her freezing gaze. Edicina's mouth thinned, and she tried to stare holes in him and the Suldam both. Even Teslin managed indignation. She was grateful for rescue too, but she was Aes Sedai, and she directed her frown at him. He suspected she would jump like a startled frog if one of the Suldam clapped her hands. What I want, he explained patiently, is for all of you to stay with the wagons. You had to be patient with women, including Aes Sedai. He was bloody well learning that by heart. One whisper there's an Aes Sedai with this show, and we'll be hip-deep in Seanchan hunting for her. Rumors of Seanchan with the show won't serve us any better. Either way, somebody will come to find out what's behind it sooner or later, and we'll all be in the pickling kettle. Don't flaunt yourselves. You need to stay low till we get closer to Lugard. That isn't so much to ask now, is it? Lightning lit up the wagon's windows with a blue flash, and thunder crashed overhead so close it rattled the wagon. It was too much to ask, apparently, as the days wore on. Oh, the Aes Sedai kept their hoods well up when they went outside. The rain gave enough excuse for that. The rain and the cold. But one or another rode on the wagon seat as often as not, and they made no real effort to pass as servants around the showfolk. Not that they admitted who they were, of course, or ordered anyone about, or even spoke to anyone much besides each other. But what servant clearly expected people to move out of her way? They went into the villages, too, and sometimes the towns, as if they were sure there were no Seanchan there. When an Aes Sedai was sure of something, it had to be true. Twice they came scurrying back when they found a town half full of settlers on their way north. They told him what they learned on their visits. He thought they did. Teslin did seem grateful after an Aes Sedai fashion, and Edicina after a fashion. Despite their differences, Jolene, Teslin, and Edicina stuck together like herded geese. If you saw one, you saw all three. Likely that was because when you saw them taking a stroll, all neatly cloaked and hidden as they were, a minute later Bethamin and Rena and Sita appeared trailing after them. Oh, so casually, but never letting the girls out of sight. The goose herds. A blind man could see there was tension between the two groups of women. A blind man could see none of them were servants. The Suldam had held respected positions, positions of authority, and they moved almost as arrogantly as the Aes Sedai. He was stuck with the story, though. Bethamin and the other two were as leery of other Seanchan as the Aes Sedai were. Yet they also followed the Aes Sedai when they went into a village or town, and Bethamin always reported the tidbits they had picked up by eavesdropping, with Rena wearing an ingratiating smile and Sita chirping in that the girls had missed this or that, or claimed not to have heard. You could never be sure with someone who had the audacity to call herself Aes Sedai. Maybe he should reconsider having them leashed, just till everything was safe. Their tales really were not that different from what the sisters told him. Townsfolk's talk of what they had overheard from Seanchan passing through. Many of the settlers were nervous, their heads full of tales about savage Aiel ravaging through Altara, though the local people all said that was up north somewhere. It seemed someone higher might be thinking the same, though, because many settlers had been diverted east toward Ilion. An alliance had been concluded with someone powerful who was expected to give the High Lady Suroth access to many lands. The women refused to be convinced that they need not listen for rumors. They never quite got around to handing over the Idam either. In truth, those silvery leashes and the three Suldam were the only real lever he had with the Aes Sedai. Gratitude. From an Aes Sedai? Ha! Not that he really thought about putting those collars on the sisters again. Not often, anyway. He was well and truly stuck. He truly did have no need of what the Suldam and Aes Sedai learned. He had better sources, people he trusted. Well, he trusted Tom, when the white-haired gleeman could be routed out from playing snakes and foxes with Alver, or mooning over a much-creased letter he carried tucked in the breast of his coat. Tom could walk into a common room, tell a story, maybe juggle a bit, and walk out knowing what was in the head of every man there. Matt trusted Julian, too. He did almost as well as Tom without juggling or storytelling. But Julian always insisted on taking Thera with him, demurely clutching his arm as they strolled into a town. To get her used to freedom again, the man said. She smiled up at Julian, those big eyes shining darkly, that full little mouth asking to be kissed. Maybe she had been Panarch of Terabon, the way Julian and Tom claimed, but Matt was beginning to doubt it. He had heard some of the contortionists joking about how the Terabonner serving girl was wearing the tyrant thief-catcher out till he could barely walk. Panarch or serving girl, though, Thera still started to kneel any time she heard a drawling accent. Matt figured that any Seanchan who asked her a question would get everything she knew, beginning with Julian Sandar and ending with which wagon the Aes Sedai were in, all answers delivered from her knees. Thera was a bigger danger than Aes Sedai and Suldam put together, in his book. Julian bridled at the slightest suggestion his woman might be unreliable, though. and spun his bamboo staff as if he was considering cracking Matt's head for him. There was no solution, but Matt found a stopgap, a way to get a little warning if the worst occurred. "Of course I can follow them," Noel said, with a gap-toothed grin that said it would be child's play. Laying a gnarled finger alongside his bent nose, he slipped the other knobbly hand beneath his coat, where he kept his knives. "Are you sure it wouldn't be better just to make sure she can't talk to anyone? Just a suggestion, lad. If you say not, then not." Matt most emphatically said not. He had killed one woman in his life, and left another to be butchered. He was not going to add a third to his soul. "It seems Suroth might have made an alliance with some king," Julian reported with a smile over a cup of mulled wine. At least Thera seemed to be making him smile more. She huddled beside Julian's stool in their cramped tent, her head lying on his lap, and he stroked her hair softly with his free hand. "At least there's considerable talk of some powerful new ally, and those settlers are all frightened out of their wits by Aiel." "Most of the settlers seem to have been sent east," Tom said, peering sadly into his cup. As Julian grew happier day by day, he seemed to grow sadder. Noel was outshadowing Julian and Thera, and Lopen and Nerem were sitting cross-legged at the back of the tent. But the two Karianan serving men had their mending baskets out, and were examining Matt's good coats from Abu Dar for any repairs they thought necessary, so the small tent still seemed crowded. "And a great many soldiers, too," Tom went on. "Everything says they're going to fall on Ilion like a hammer." Well, at least he knew he was hearing the unvarnished truth when he heard it from them. No Aes Sedai spinning words in their heads, or Suldam trying to smarm their way into his good graces. Bethamin and Sita had even learned to curtsy. Somehow he felt more comfortable with Rena bending herself double. It seemed honest. Strange, but honest. For himself, town or village, Matt took no more than a quick look around, with his collar turned up and his cap pulled down, before heading back to the show. He seldom wore a cloak. A cloak could make it difficult to use the knives he carried tucked about his person. Not that he expected to need them. It was just a prudent precaution. There was no drinking, no dancing, and no gambling. Especially no gambling. The sound of dice rattling on a table in an inn's common room pulled at him, but his sort of luck with dice was bound to be remarked, even if it did not lead to somebody pulling a knife, and in this part of Altara, both men and women carried knives tucked behind their belts and were ready to use them. He wanted to pass through unnoticed, so he walked by the dice games, nodded coolly to the tavern maids who smiled at him, and never drank more than a cup of wine, and usually not that. After all, he had work to do back at the show. Work of a sort. He had begun it the very first night after leaving Abu Dar, and a rough job it was. "I need you to go with me," he had said then, pulling open the cupboard built into the side of the wagon beneath his bed. He kept his chest of gold in there, all honestly come by through gambling. As honestly as he could, anyway. The greater part came from one horse race, and his luck was no better than any other man's with horses. For the rest, if a man wanted to toss dice or play at cards or pitch coins, he had to be ready to lose. Doman, seated on the other bed, rubbing a hand over the bristle on his shaved scalp, had learned that lesson. The fellow should have been willing to sleep on the floor like a good Sojin, but in the beginning he had insisted on flipping a coin with Matt each night for the second bed. Eginin got the first, of course. Tossing coins was as easy as dice, as long as the coin did not land on edge, the way it sometimes did for him. But Doman had made the offer, not him. Until Matt had won 4 times straight, and then the 5th night the coin did land on edge, 3 times in a row. They took turn and turnabout now. But it was still Doman's turn for the floor tonight. Finding the smallish wash leather bag he was after, he stuffed it into his coat pocket and straightened, pushing the cupboard shut with his foot. "You have to face her sometime," he said, "and I need you to smooth things over." He needed someone to attract Tuan's ire, someone to make him seem acceptable by comparison. But he could not say that, could he? "You're a Shan noble, and you can keep me from putting my boot in my mouth." "Why do you need to smooth things over?" Eginen's drawl was hard as a saw. She stood against the wagon's door with her fists on her hips, blue eyes auguring out from beneath her long black wig. "Why do you need to see her? Haven't you done enough?" "Don't tell me you're afraid of her," Matt scoffed, dodging the question. What answer could he give that did not sound insane? "You could tuck her under your arm almost as easily as I could." but I promise not to let her cut your head off or beat you up.
Again, do not be afraid of anything, boy, Doman growled protectively. If she does not want to go, then you trot off to court the girl by yourself. Stay the night if you choose.
Aginin continued to glare at Matt, or through him. Then she glanced at Doman, her shoulders slumped a little, and she snatched her cloak from its peg on the wall. Get a move on, Carthen, she growled. If it has to be done, best it's done and over with. She was out of the wagon in a flash, and Matt had to hurry to catch her up. You could almost think she did not want to be alone with Doman, as little sense as that made. Outside the windowless purple wagon, black in the night, a shadow shifted in the deeper shadows. The sickle moon came out from behind the clouds long enough for Matt to recognize Harnon's lantern jaw.
All quiet, my lord,
The file leader said. Matt nodded and took a deep breath, feeling for the wash leather bag in his pocket. The air was clean, washed by the rain, and away from the horse lines. Tuan must be relieved to be away from the dung smell and the rank odor of the animal cages. The performers' wagons to his left were as dark as the canvas-topped storage wagons to his right. No use waiting any longer. He pushed Aginin up the purple wagon's steps ahead of him. There were more people inside than he expected. Satala was seated on one of the beds, working her embroidery hoop again, and Selucia stood at the far end, scowling beneath her headscarf, but Noel was sitting on the other bed, apparently lost in thought, and Tuan sat cross-legged on the floor, playing snakes and foxes with Olver. The boy twisted around with a wide-mouthed grin that almost split his face when Matt came in. Noel has been telling us about Kodansin, Matt, he exclaimed. That's another name for Shara. Did you know the Ayad tattoo their faces? That's what they call women who can channel in Shara. No, I didn't, Matt said, settling a grim eye on Noel. It was bad enough that Bannon and the Red Arms were teaching the boy bad habits, not to mention what he was picking up from Julian and Tom, without Noel filling his head with made-up nonsense. Suddenly Noel slapped his thigh and sat up straight. I remember now, he said, and then the fool began to recite. Fortune rides like the sun on high, with the fox that makes the ravens fly. Luck his soul, the lightning his eye, he snatches the moons from out of the sky. The broken-nosed old man looked around as if just realizing anyone else was there. I've been trying to remember that. It's from the prophecies of the dragon. Very interesting, Noel, Matt muttered. Those colors whirled in his head just the way they had that morning when the Aes Sedai were panicking. They flashed away without making a picture this time, but he felt as cold as if he had spent a night sleeping under a bush in his skin. The last thing on earth he needed was anybody else linking him to the prophecies. Maybe sometime you can recite the whole thing for us.
Alright, everyone, I'm gonna call into his life for tonight. Back's starting to hurt. But I want to thank everyone for stopping by and everyone who continues to stop by. I definitely appreciate all y'all's support. Until next time, everyone, y'all stay safe out there.